You're muted still.
There you go. Someone had to do it, so I wanted to be first. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've been visiting with a few of your water systems. I was at the Texas Water Show in Fort Worth a few months back. It's always a pleasure to be in the area. So I took the liberty of going on some of your web pages. If you go to the next slide, Alyssa. So it looks like that animation didn't quite work, but anyway, I went on your webpage and just to see, nearly every city has some messaging about conserving water, and so I just pulled these off of yours. There's some tips for inside, there's tips for outside. Some of them came from our things published by the DOE or the EPA that have been just placed on your pages. Some of them are uniquely created. But regardless, I think we as cities have got a pretty good idea of how to tell our residents to use less water. But this presentation is what can we as a city do, or what can you as a city do to use less water and also less energy. So I'm going to go through a couple of those things. If you go ahead and advance, Alyssa. So these facts are from the DOE's webpage or the EPA's webpage. As much as 40% of operating costs for drinking water systems can be for energy. It's typically your second highest cost behind labor. Operating costs for a water system is moving water around. The EPA estimates that 2% of energy use in the entire United States is for water and wastewater. And in most cities, I know that some of your agencies have got like regional wastewater treatment plants. For cities that have their own wastewater plant, usually the single largest power bill that they pay as a city is for their wastewater treatment plant. But as I engage with cities all over the country, there are exceptions, but typically the rule is that the people moving water or treating wastewater never see the power bill. There's no understanding from them on how much energy it takes to do their job, and so therefore there's no, you're not closing that feedback loop. When they change their behavior and it just comes in and someone in accounts payable just pays it, they can't learn and do kind of sometimes sensible things to reduce energy use. So we're going to go through a couple of those things today in my presentation. These are common. I'm going to share a couple things to do to conserve water and energy, and then I'll point out a couple common inefficiencies that I see all over the country. So go ahead, Alyssa. So unaccounted water. Unaccounted water is something that this is water that you produce for your water system, but when you add up all the water delivered to your residents, to their businesses, there's a difference, and that difference is unaccounted water. So when you do fire department, when you do fire department does testing on your hydrants, that's unaccounted water. That water doesn't end up being paid for by residents. When you do routine line flushing, or sometimes cities have bulk water sales for construction or for dust reduction type things, and sometimes those bulk water sales are managed without metering the connection. And then I do come across a not insignificant number of cities that don't meter the water they use for city landscaping and parks. But typically unaccounted water, when we talk about that, we're talking about leaks. This is an example I just pulled off the internet of a leak. I do not have rights to share that image, so hopefully there won't be any repercussions from that. I just found it, but it was a massive leak, obviously, and this is one that wherever this is that would respond to. In addition to large leaks like this, that your system, at surface, your crews go out and fix. There are thousands of leaks that are smaller, of smaller magnitude that don't get reported. They don't surface. They just end up going into the water table, and you never know or see. But there's energy that goes into every gallon of water in your water system. You've done something to it. You've pumped it, you've treated it, you've pulled it out of a well, you've purchased it from a wholesaler, and they've put energy into getting in the pipes. So when that water is lost through leaks, you're losing water, obviously, that you've paid for, but or in some instances, but also you're wasting the energy associated with that. And every system in Texas reports to the state every year about their unaccounted water percentage. And there's I went and found the website where that resides. I spent way too much time compiling data, but once I got started, I couldn't stop. So on the next slide is a breakdown of this is the self-reported unaccounted water percentage for the cities only. I didn't include the water agencies, but just the municipal cities that have reported to the state. These are the percentage. The best I saw was a 2.5% unaccounted water percentage. The worst was just under 44%. That's a pretty big number. But mostly you were distributed in the upper, maybe between 8 and 12%, or 8 and 14% was where the breakdown was. Now these numbers are very dependent upon the accuracy of your flow meters. Leaks happen, and they're always going to happen. When I see numbers around the 2.5% mark, I typically think that's probably a reporting error. Most systems aren't going to get that good, but that 8, 9, 10% range, that's kind of the sweet spot. That's where I think a reasonable system that's staying on top of this can achieve. And if you don't know what your unaccounted water percentage number is, then you should do a little digging. Talk to your public works director or your whoever's submitting that number to the state, and find out what your number is as for your city, and then see what you can to make it better, if possible. I'm certainly not advocating for any of them, but there are third-party companies that will come out and using listening will help find leaks that aren't there, and they'll help quantify what those might be. I know there's some satellite usages now that look for chlorine residuals in water that's just under the surface, and that can help point to where there might be leaks. But regardless, I think the important message here is that water loss is energy loss. And the Texas Water Development Board has a number of resources that can help cities get their arms around their unaccounted water. So if you talk to the people inside, or maybe you already know your number, and if you find you're in the 14% or higher range, I'd reach out to the Texas Water Development Board and see what resources they can provide to you to help get your arms around this. There are, it certainly costs money to stay on top of leaks. It costs money to find the leaks. It costs money to fix the leaks. But I guess the message here is that there's also a cost to ignoring the leaks, and those costs can be big. I talked to a city pretty recently that is not inside Texas, but in one of your neighboring states. And I asked them, what's your unaccounted water percentage? There are two people on the call. One said 40%, and the other said 60%. And I was astonished. This was a major metropolitan city, and they just have grown to live with losses. And there's a huge cost to the residents and to the ratepayers for that type of behavior. I guess Q&A is at the end, so we'll move on with other stuff around this. But the other side to losses, to leaks, has to do with your water pressure. So this is the same pipe. Obviously, one is at high pressure and one is at almost no pressure. You can see a little bit of water trickling out there on the picture on the right, but it's the same cut. And so for water systems, typically there's a sweet spot in the pressure that arrives at your residents' homes, somewhere between 45 psi on the low end and up to about 100 psi on the high end. The higher your pressure is in your system, the more water is lost when you do have leaks. And I've seen systems where the pressure is substantially higher, like up into the 150, 200 range. And that can be not only dangerous to your crews and to your residents, but it results in a whole lot of losses. from when leaks do occur. You get more leaks, and when leaks do happen, you lose more water. I've got a case study. This is a city in Utah. I live in Utah that we worked with. This is actually the city. Go ahead and advance this if you would, please. Logan City, they've given us permission to share their story. Logan is where my grandma and my mom grew up. My grandma had a house there, and it's where Utah State University is. They've got a number of deep wells. They've got a spring, and I thought they treated water coming out of the canyon as well, but maybe not. Anyway, regardless, they approached our partners, our aqua efficiency partners. They were looking for another transmission main because they were having a hard time. Go ahead and advance one. In the summertime, they were having a hard time staying on top of water. Their wells are in the bottom of the valley. Their terminal tank is up on the hillside above Utah State. If I didn't have kind of the picture blocked out in the back, you might be able to see it on the hillside. Right about behind the word main line is where that terminal reservoir is. They're having a hard time keeping that terminal reservoir in the summer, so they thought, well, we need another main line from where our wells are up to the hill. They were having substantial main breaks, over 300 per year, high pressure. At my grandma's house growing up as a kid, like I had to have someone else fill a glass of water for me because the water came out of the faucet so intensely that it would knock the glass out of my hand. And taking a shower at grandma's house was an experience. It was really intense. So they reached out to our partners, and the partners said, well, let's do some analysis of your system before you throw the cost into putting their main line in. So let's advance one more. This next slide is this is a hydraulic model that you're looking at. It shows all the nodes in their system. And there's that kind of red or dot right there that's flashing. That's one of their wells that they would use to fill the terminal tank, which is represented by the T up on the hillside on your right. They thought when they turned that pump on, the water would go up that direct line straight to the terminal. But when we did a simulation in their hydraulic model of where the water was going, what they found was the water wasn't going uphill at all. It was there were demands in the system below, and it was getting pulled downhill, and that was part of what the problem was. And so a solution, in fact, the solution they ended up doing in Logan, if you advance one slide, is they split their water system into two pressure zones, about where that purple line is. And they created a higher pressure zone and a lower pressure zone. The lower pressure zone now is closer to that 45 psi to 100 psi range, and the hillside is also about that 45 to 100 psi range. And so now when they turn that well on, which we didn't simulate, the water actually goes uphill because the water is staying in the zone where it's intended. And so if you're a system that's mostly flat, if you've got a hilly system, you're probably already on top of multiple pressure zones. But if you have complaints from residents that like really when they turn the water on, it comes out intensely, or they've got regulators in the house failing, you might have a situation where you have high pressures, and that might be something to look at. But let's advance a slide and we'll see the result from them. Even though this was not an energy or water saving project, it was a water delivery project, they found that after they divided the pressure zones, their main breaks dropped by 40%. The water use in their overall system dropped by 17%, and their energy use dropped by 30%. And that was simply because they were losing less water, they had less pressure, the system was safer. I think there's one more slide on Logan. Yeah. So less water wasted with less money wasted. They had fewer complaints. It was safer for their crews. They eliminated, this was a handful of years ago. That project would probably been a $6 million transmission project now. But and they postponed the construction of a new water source simply by using their water more smartly. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about, and the next slide, is source selection. This is an area of huge opportunity for cities. So maybe you guys can consider in your own systems, how many water sources do you have? How much energy does it take to produce 1 million gallons from each of them? You might in your system have deep wells. You might have some shallow wells if you're close to a surface water source. You might have treated surface water that you deal with. You might have bulk water that you hire or that you purchase. I mean, each of those is going to have a certain amount of energy embedded in it. or you will be embedding that energy into it to get beneficial use out of it. And calculating the million gallons, or sorry, the kilowatt hours per million gallons from each of those source is a really useful way to make intelligent decisions about how you source your water. And I guess without that information, the question maybe is, how are you currently prioritizing your water sourcing and why? And I promise you, your operators have favorite water sources. They have favorite wells, they have favorite boosters. I don't know why they pick them, but they do. And they're, without other outside guidance, they're going to use those sources. And sometimes those sources are not the most efficient. So I've got a couple examples for you. This is a wholesale water supplier, Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District. We did this exercise for them, and you can see there that their best water source was their large water treatment plant, Jordan Valley Water Treatment Plant. And it's compared to their most intensive wells in Carroll Way and Salina Way, that's like a 20x difference between their cheapest water source and their most expensive water source. But some of these most expensive water sources, energy-wise, were their newest wells. They dug these deep new wells. They had shiny, high-efficiency motors, high-efficiency well pumps. But the reality is they had to lift the water a long ways to get it to the surface, to get it to a pressure where they could use it. Whereas the water flowing into the Jordan Valley Water Treatment Plant mostly came from gravity-fed sources. It mostly fed out of that plant through gravity. It was a very efficient well. I'm sorry, a water source. It was a surface water treatment plant. And so they hadn't really considered the ramifications of that. But once we showed them these numbers, they shifted their water production largely to their two water treatment plants and away from their wells, and they reduced their energy use by 19% in the first 2 years, which is a huge benefit. And these are comments from them. They I don't know. We had them in quotes, so presumably someone on their group said it. But anyway, the guideline is where conditions permit, where you've got water source permit to allow it, or maybe the practicality of where the water's coming into your system. Find out what your lowest cost water sources are and use them. Use them the most, and then supplement. And so, for a lot of your water systems in the summertime, there's not a lot of flexibility in how you source your water. You kind of just run everything. But in the shoulder season, in the winter, is where you can make money. You can save money on your water system and save energy by shutting off the most energy intensive sources first and running the best sources longest. Let's go to the next one. This is, Alyssa mentioned we've been working with San Antonio. This is SAW's. This chart is going to show up in their energy strategy master plan. It was approved. It was presented at the end of last year, for actually the first month of this year. It was approved by their board. It is public record, but because it's not available on a website yet, I kind of blocked that out. I know if you squint, you can probably make out the words, but anyway, these are real numbers from them. We did this exercise for they've got 9 water portfolios. The Edwards is the Edwards Aquifer. That's where most of their infrastructure is. And then they've been spending a lot of money diversifying their water source, because the Edwards Aquifer it's in a drought situation right now. The water's not available, and San Antonio's made agreements that they will reduce their dependence on Edwards first, so that other communities can use it longer. But you can see that on an energy intensity basis only, it is much less than their most intensive sources and better than any other source. And then when you consider their infrastructure investment as a sunk cost, and you just look at what is the dollar cost per million gallons, it is hands down their best source. So this raised a lot of eyebrows when we presented this to San Antonio's operating groups, because they had been really working on trying to bring in these other sources, and they'd committed to large amounts of water from some of these more energy intensive sources. And in many cases, there's not a lot of flexibility on what they can do, but at least now they know the numbers. They can make decisions on how they source their water. And when they get to the slow times of years for demand, they can try to use the sources that will require the least amount of energy and the least amount of money. I've got two more examples. One's from Yakima, Washington. The other one is North Salt Lake. Alyssa mentioned that I was on the city council. That's where I was on the city council, is North Salt Lake. So this first one, those animations go fast, but there were some animations that would lead into this slower. But anyway, this is a Nob Hill Water Association. They gave us permission as well to share this. They source their water from Zone 3. Well, they've got wells in Zone, well, one is also, but one of their best wells is in Zone 3, and they source more water in Zone 3, pressure zone, than they can use. So what they had been doing was lowering all the water down into Zone 1 and then boosting it into Zone 2. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to be able to adjust the levels in the water tank in Zone 2 and get make sure that the water age didn't get too old, that they had good chlorine residuals. But that meant that every drop of water that went into Zone 2, they had to boost, whereas they could have gravity fed it from Zone 3 because they had a valve already, the valve on the left, but it wasn't a smart valve. They couldn't control the flow. Anyway, they ended up tweaking that valve to get part of the flow through that valve, and part of it they still boost, but they've got a long-term plan now to put a control valve, which I've indicated on the valve on the right, that they can actually use that valve to open and close to simulate what they're getting from their booster pump and still make sure they have fresh, good water in Zone 2, but not have to boost it from Zone 1. This include, in addition to a focus on reducing their overall leaks, save them about 10% of their energy use on an annual basis. One more example for you. This is from North Salt Lake, where I was on the city council. This is North Salt Lake has got an area on the flats by the Great Salt Lake where I lived, and then there was this hillside going up the mountain. And this is a view just off of Google Earth. I kind of panned the camera to get a picture. It's about 1,500 feet elevation gain from the bottom of the valley where the water sources are to the top. And as you can see, I've added in a booster station that looks like a little house and then a little tank up on the top. That booster station sits on our golf course because, of course, why wouldn't you build a golf course on the top of a hill where it takes the most amount of energy to produce the water? But that's what we did. And in Utah, people want their houses where there's beautiful views. So up around this golf course are these big mansions. And in order to get the water up to there, there's multiple booster stations. We have to boost the water up multiple times to get to those tanks as a city. So we've got a simulation here as well from the hydraulic model, this next one. I'll explain it. This, where it has booster pump is... well, we started the simulation already, but where the booster pump is, that was the little house that I showed you, and then the tank up on the hill is the very top. And we simulated if we turn if this is water boosted from that booster pump to that tank, and the percentage of the water in the pipe that came from that source. And what we saw was that the water, rather than staying up at the top where we boosted it, it was flowing all the way down the hill again. And effectively what we were doing as a city is we were pumping that water in circles. We were pumping up the hill, and because of our valve configurations, it was flowing downhill to the lower pressure zone, and then we were boosting it again. And this is a super common problem because residents that live at the top of their pressure zone, where they maybe only get 40 PSI or 45 PSI pressure, they might complain because they don't have as much water pressure as they want. And a well-meaning operator might go tweak that boundary valve between the lower pressure zone and the higher pressure zone and start allowing the water to flow. And they mean well, but it doesn't actually help the problem. And it causes this situation over time. And that's what happened in our city. So let's advance one more. This is now the simulation from the same booster pump to the same tank. And let's see, the next one. Oh, no, I guess this is the change. Yeah, perfect. So now we've adjusted the valves so the water stays where it's supposed to. And you can see that the water is staying in that higher pressure zone. It's not flowing down the hill. And in this case, two guys in a truck in one afternoon went out and they eliminated 25% of the energy use in the city just by adjusting those valves. And as an bonus, the residents that lived in those big mansions up on the hill saw dramatically improved water pressure because now there was less water flowing. The system was behaving like it was designed. And so our customer complaints also dropped. in those higher zones. Hey, I think those were the topics I wanted to cover, and I think I'm on time. Any questions for me?
Yeah, you did a great job on the timing. Thank you so much, Matt. So yes, we have time for questions for Matt before we roll into our next speaker. You can do this one of two ways. You can put your question in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function, and I'll invite you to unmute and share your question. I did have a question. I know one thing that's popular in our region a lot is reservoir building to increase surface water supply. In general, and this may be really, really general, but do you find that it's more energy efficient to access water using or source using groundwater or reservoirs, that surface water? What is in general better for energy conservation?
For most systems, and I can think of one system where does not apply. For most systems I've worked with, treating surface water takes less energy than pumping out wells from the aquifer. Aquifers, we're definitely getting a better understanding over time of how aquifers recharge. But if you view your surface water as a renewable source that comes every time the rain falls, and your aquifer water as an emergency standby storage, that's a much better way to run a system, and it's a much more sustainable way to run a system. So installing reservoirs and treating surface water typically will take less energy and will also help maintain the levels of the aquifer underwater or underground.
Excellent. That's good to know.
And usually you get a nice amenity in your community where people can go and recreate on the edge of the reservoir.
Exactly. You had talked about the Texas Water Development Board reporting. In general, we are kind of as a region looking at how much energy we're expending treating across all of our 16 counties, treating surface and groundwater. Is that, if I take those numbers from Texas Water Development Board, do I then need to do a calculation to account for the unaccounted water as well? That's not included in the Texas Water Development Board reporting, is it correct?
No, so I found a table where that listed the total water produced, the total water delivered, and then it broke down the unaccounted water. They made estimates on leaks, they made estimates on reporting errors, they made all of it, a bunch of different things.
Okay.
Those are the numbers that I gathered in order to create that chart. So those numbers are all there. They're being reported on an annual basis by most of your agencies. They because it's required by I don't know if it's federal law or state law, but everyone does it around the country that I work with.
Sure.
And most of it's a number that most people just know. If your people in your water system, they know their unaccounted water number. If you were to go and leave this meeting, go to your public works director and say, hey, what's our unaccounted water number from last year? They will know the number.
Good to know. Any more questions for Matt? Matt, will you put your email on the screen? Will you also just drop it in the chat should people want to reach out to you with other questions privately?
Sure, of course.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, let's roll into our next speaker then. Steve Cavanaugh, PE, is the president and CEO of Cavanaugh Associates. As in his time there, he has served as a creative visionary with unshakable dedication to environmental stewardship and preservation, which has led him to work with public and private sectors, both nationally and internationally, for over 3 decades, developing solutions to some of today's most challenging issues. Steve has dedicated his career to advancing water efficiency practices and harnessing renewable energy. His next frontier is illuminating the carbon associated with utility leakage and helping chart the course for effective reduction. He serves as the chair for the International Water Association Water Loss Specialist Group's Leakage Emissions Initiative. Steve has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from NC State University and is a licensed professional engineer. And now, Steve, welcome. You may begin.
There we go. Good afternoon, all, and great presentation. Matt, I'm actually going to pick up on several key themes, so I'm very, very appreciative of the opportunity to get with this group today. I think maybe where some of you, or how I got to this meeting today, is from the Texas Water Loss Control Committee that actually has been formulated coming out of the Texas Water Development Board. So I'm going to bridge back to a couple things there. But there are several roles that are on this slide that I think are important. One is the outreach chair for the Water Loss Control Committee of AWWA. And actually in that role, I do a lot of speaking on non-revenue water. We are educating constantly about the movement away from unaccounted for water. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and sort of bring some perspective, I think, Matt, to some of the numbers that you're pulling from what's been posted from the Texas Water Development Board. And then the exciting piece that I want to talk about is certainly the carbon energy nexus and ways that we can hopefully start to leverage and to really accelerate leakage reduction projects and attention to that based on the carbon. So let's go next slide if we can. So obviously there's a lot of interest. We're seeing Standard & Poor's bond rating agencies now really starting to lean in and look at and start to sort of make some of the ratings for the individual municipalities dependent upon how they're managing use and loss. And they see globally that there's quite a bit of energy that's embedded, certainly the CO2 or the carbon associated with that energy that goes into the water utility that Matt described. And certainly a large portion of the water itself, obviously the quantity of water that you can see there on the screen. Next slide. One more graphic to sort of reinforce the importance. And many times, and I've kind of been at this for quite a while, since early 2000, of teaching non-revenue water leakage management best practices. And in most cases, utilities are busy. They may have their hands around use and loss somewhat, but unfortunately, it's still pervasive of this unaccounted for water percentage. And Standard & Poor's actually is starting to now look at it and say, okay, but what does that mean in terms of financially? What is the non-revenue water? They also have been looking at the carbon associated with that. So very briefly, I think it might be good to just talk a little bit about AWWA and best practices on non-revenue water to sort of help to set the stage. So next slide very quickly. I'll just drop that up so you can read that. But basically in 2003, AWWA abandoned the terminology unaccounted for water, because when I'll show the water balance in a bit, there's actually a compartment, if you will, or a bucket in the water balance where we can manage and be able to track each of our uses in the distribution system. So sliding back a bit, so to the leakage emissions initiative, in Prague at the water loss conference, basically with the International Water Association, we recognized that globally funding had really moved away from leakage reduction projects. And it's the same here in the States. While there may be an interest in helping on asset rehabilitation and recovery, in many cases, there's not a lot of funding. And so what we recognized is that there is quite a bit of funding that is being directed towards carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction. And so on the international front, the International Water Association, we basically said, can we do a similar thing that was done for the water balance in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where we can better manage usage and loss? And can we definitively tie the carbon associated with leakage together? Can we somehow be able to tap into the funding that's going on for carbon reduction internationally? And can we do that defensively? So that's how in 2002, the Leakage Emissions Initiative idea really started. We knew intuitively that we could do it, but we wanted to gather together a group and actually come up with a methodology and publish that. Next slide. So that was where we established the Leakage Emissions Initiative website and pulled together. At the time, it was 55 water professionals from 22 nations, and for about 2 years, we started really looking at how water utility systems are accounting for the energy that's embedded in their distribution systems and also the leakage. And then looking at that in terms of what is the carbon intensity associated, excuse me, with that energy. Next slide. So in April, actually, of 2023, this group came to a conclusion and published the Leakage Emissions Initiative methodology. So these are some of the countries that are represented, the 22 countries. And you can see a lot of folks from the United States were involved in that through the Water Loss Control Committee and the Real Loss Subcommittee. Actually produced the white paper in April of 2023. It was peer reviewed and actually published, next slide, on the IWA website. So this is a link, and I'll actually drop these in the chat in the Q&A, where you can go to it and download the actual white paper, read it, understand the methodology to get your hands around it. So this is now a published, internationally published peer-reviewed document, and I'm excited to share that at ACE, the AWWA National Conference last week, the Water Loss Control Committee actually adjoined and unanimously approved what we call the committee report for North America, which is essentially this exact white paper with a few small nuances and changes. Next slide. So to give a little of the background and the math that goes behind it is fairly simple, and that is how dirty is our energy source that's coming into the water distribution system. So Matt talked about the amount of energy going into each individual distribution system and the sources. He also mentioned of looking at those sources of energy out there from a cost standpoint, but there also is really there's sources of fuel supply. So as an example, if a utility is a combined cycle facility, so they may use coal and natural gas. Those are all carbon intense, have a lot of carbon intensity associated with that energy, the production of that electricity that the water utility is using. So we need to know really how dirty is the energy source in terms of grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The next thing is how much energy does the utility use to deliver the annual water production? So obviously we need to know through a water balance, and I'll describe that in detail in just a moment, how much water we're producing on an annual basis, but also the energy that it took to produce that distributed water. So this is the extraction, this is the treatment, this is the delivery into the distribution system. And that's in terms of kilowatts per million gallons. In some cases, that's a compilation from a bill, and you know what the cost per kilowatt hour is on a monthly basis and being able to tabulate those together. So if you have those numbers, how dirty the energy is, and I'll give a resource of where that information comes from, how much energy the water utility uses, so that's our electricity in kilowatt hours, and how much water production, we can get to a utility-specific carbon intensity. This is the grams of CO2 per million gallons of water that's actually produced. Next slide. So this is an example of a resource where you can get energy information. This is carbon intensity associated with the energy that the water utility is actually using or importing into their utility system. So in this case, this is around, I think this is Indianapolis. So 555 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour that's produced. And these maps, this is electricitymaps.com, but there's also eGrid that's available on a number of energy sources. And the utility companies themselves are now very, very carefully reporting based on their supply. If again, it's nuclear, wind, solar, carbon intense, such as fuel source of coal or natural gas, they have these numbers also to be able to share those out there. Next slide. So this I want to spend a little bit more time just based on some of the things that Matt was sharing earlier. And I would say that this is the water balance. And again, just a little bit of a discrepancy. And Texas is moving extremely quickly. There may be some older data that's still on their software that's reported in percentage, but Texas has just passed a validation step where they actually have John Sutton and Daniel Rice and Mark Mathis at the Water Development Board are doing water utility validations of the audits that are being submitted to actually improve upon the reliability, but also to help educate the water utilities on the best practices of non-revenue water using the water balance. This is a snapshot from the free water audit software from AWWA, and the Texas Water Development Board is in the process of reformulating their online portal to actually mirror this to also include the validation numbers as well. But the way you read this is we have our total system input volume, and that's from either own sources. So this may be from a river where we're taking the water, or we may be buying water from somewhere else, or a well system that would be volume from own sources. Those two combined together give us our total system input volume. And if you see, those two columns add up to equal the total system input volume. And then if we are actually selling water or exporting water that never travels through our distribution system, then that is water that is exported. So we don't really count that relative to leakage in our distribution system because it's never really had an opportunity to make its way. It would be sold before. If, however, an offtake of that water is in or a meter within our distribution system, then that would be treated as a billed metered connection and not an export. But back to the balance, if you see, that gives us the water supply. So we pulled off that export water. So we now have water supply that's into the distribution system. So our water supplied, again, the columns add, that gives us either authorized consumption or water loss. And in many cases, this percentage that AWWA abandoned in 2003 is simply taking water supplied minus our authorized consumption, and that equals water loss, taking that number and then dividing back through by water supply to get to the percentage. This is calculated so many different ways, which is why it's inconsistent and it's not an indicator of performance. But when we sort of get to it, we have to break down that loss into either apparent loss or water that reaches a customer, but it's not properly measured or billed. And its impact to us is actually at what we could sell that water for. So we have very different strategies. It's metering improvements. It's looking at, our system data handling errors. It's looking at theft in our system. So the way that we go and address apparent losses, that's very, very different than how we address leakage. But if we take our water supplied minus authorized consumption minus apparent losses, again, the largest portion of errors or apparent losses is through customer metering and accuracy errors in our metering, then that gives us leakage. But we need to go a step further. So I want to go next slide if we could, and say that that's not where it stops. And now I'm going to bridge this back to the leakage emissions initiative and say, now we have gone through the water balance, we've done the water audit, and we've got what we call a top-down indication of real loss or leakage in our distribution system. And this matches up to what Matt was saying of what can be controlled by pressure, what we can intervene with, actually reducing the awareness, locate, and repair time. And we have different strategies, but now we have our water balance real loss, if you see by example on the top, and I'm showing how it comes from the balance to what's called now a leakage component analysis. So that leakage component analysis further breaks down the leakage. And we say, okay, we know the leaks that for a year that we go and interact with and repair, and we're making estimates of, those are what is known as reported leakage. So that is the leakage that we have discovered, we've repaired, we know about out in the distribution system. On the other side of this chart, we have background leakage. And the way that this is leakage that is not detectable. These are the weeps and seeps. This is our technical minimum, if you will, in the distribution system based on, as Matt said, the system operating pressure, the pressure that we're operating, the infrastructure condition factor, the miles of main that we have, the number of service connections. So that's a technical minimum that we have, that unless we change pressure or we change the asset itself, we dig up and make asset rehabilitation or a new line in that, we're not going to change that. And we're also not going to be able to detect it in the distribution system. What we can detect and build leakage reduction projects is the unreported leakage. And so by example, in getting this to the carbon tie, this is a standard process by which utilities go through. They do the water balance, which gives us a top down, and now we build bottom up through breaking down that leakage of how much is reported, how much is background, which is calculable, and then to get to our unreported leakage. So in this example, we've got 3,700 million gallons of recoverable leakage. Okay, next slide. So back to the water balance and thinking about the math in the leakage emissions initiative. So it's important that we do this on the entire system, and we do it as a validated water audit and balance itself. The green boxes here now are taking that utility-specific carbon intensity, the number of grams of CO2 per million gallons, and we're applying that to the water balance uniformly. So that's for our system for our audit year looking in reverse. So we now have the end of 2023, we've got 12 months of data. We're able to do the water balance, which we're showing here. We do the water audit itself. We've now broken down each of our components. And we see that we have a total real loss of 6,525 tons of leakage. Next slide. So back to our example, if we now are doing a leakage reduction project, we've gone through the component analysis. We've said, okay, we're going to attack the unreported leakage in our distribution system, which is 3,700 million gallons. Well, that equals 3,780 metric tons based on that utility-specific carbon intensity. So now you can just think about it. The original initiative was in Prague to try to make this tie. And if we can show that by reducing leakage, which we should be reducing anyway, but in some cases it's financial, in some cases it's priorities. But now if we can say, hey, not only are we reducing leakage, but we're also reducing metric tons of carbon in a defensible way, then that might accelerate leakage reduction projects. Next slide. I've already mentioned this, but last week in Anaheim, we approved the IWA Leakage Emissions Initiative white paper. We now have adjoined that with a committee report. This is a sample calculation just to sort of see how those examples that or the numbers that I just came to, the volume supplied in the example on the left in imperial units. So 10,000 million gallons per year. A reference carbon intensity, pulling that from eGrid or electricitymaps.com or the local power provider to the utility at 540 grams per kilowatt hour. How much energy the utility uses, kilowatts per hours per year or megawatts, and then getting to the utility energy intensity to get to our utility carbon intensity to get to the number of grams per million gallons. Now we're doing a leakage reduction project. In this case, it's 1,450 million gallons or 1.4 billion. We have a carbon reduction that is calculable as shared earlier, the number of grams per year to get to the number of metric tons. So on the leakage emissions website, I'll put a link up there, but the carbon calculator is there, the white paper, all of the background reference material, but you can go to and be able to do the carbon calculation on your own. Next slide. So when the initiative started, in at least the early stages, we talked about the creation of a carbon leakage credit. And the concept was, hey, we have industry out here. We've got BP, Shell, Nestle, who are out here buying carbon credits because they have an activity that has a carbon intensity of, let's just say, 50. So their activity is at 50. Well, if they can invest in projects that are minus 250, that are actually reducing the carbon, that helps that individual multinational company get to their carbon neutrality goals. So we think that this could still be a strategy, and the concept would be, well, hey, now BP would come to Austin, Texas and say, I want to buy your leakage rights. If you'll guarantee for me that if I fund it, you'll then reduce the leakage, then I can help monetize that carbon. So to do that, we have to have it go through a registry, Gold Standard, Vera, CAR, several of them out there. And what we've seen is a real reluctance for any new carbon trading market or carbon verification. And there's also what's called additionality, where there's a concern that, hey, why should we be rewarding and creating this carbon credit, leakage credit market when utilities should have done that in the first place? Our pivot and pushback has always been, for years, utilities know they should be reducing leakage, but if we can now help to drive that by putting finance in, then we shouldn't be penalized. So we're still working on developing the carbon leakage credit. But the next slide, if you could. The thing that's very, very exciting, and I think where we're really starting to see some traction, is on a state level and globally what's called nationally determined contributions. So each country that's part of the Paris Accords has a strategy of reducing their carbon by a certain amount. Next slide. We have it in the states, in several states as well. So there's statutory executive targets, recommended targets. One that's highlighted here for New York is to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And so what we are now doing is we're helping states that have developed this strategy or this goal and say, if you fund leakage reduction projects, you're really funding greenhouse gas reduction projects. And so this will help you get to your targets. And we're doing this on the state level here in North America and the United States, but also internationally to get to the climate ministries and the environment ministries that are scrambling to try to reach those targets and goals. Next slide. So that's carbon insetting. That's helping the individual states, or in some cases, the companies. So companies may have their goals as I described before, and they see what's called the charismatic projection. Not only are they reducing carbon, but by getting involved with a utility and helping them reduce their leakage, they're also now saving water. And in many cases, this also could be an area where rates are already high on disadvantaged communities, to be able to really have the kind of the triple effect of leveraging that funding. We see this as coming. It's not there yet, but we see this as a major next step. Last thing I'll do, and then I'll open for questions. Next slide, please. Is talking about the horizon. I mentioned the verification body, Gold Standard, VeraCAR, as bodies out there. The links that I'll drop in the chat here in just a bit. There's a case studies tab that shows New Jersey American Water, 2 utilities in Jamaica, 1 in South Africa, and they're coming every day of bringing forward to, in essence, show we have already, because of our past work of reducing leakage, we've already reduced this many metric tons. The importance of posting those up is to help attract additional funding and to be able to see that the projects actually are indeed reducing metric tons of carbon. Educating global financial institutions on this concept of naturally determined determinations. So some current concerns, we think that we can make the case that if you did not interact with that leakage, that it was going to continue to leak. That's a physical fact. And not only is it going to leak, but those leaks are going to get larger. There's a rate of rise of leakage in every distribution based on the physics. So we're trying to work through the horizon at which we could count that. And then what about new leakage after a reduction project? You see this often of where you repair a leak and then either attenuation of pressure. You now have given the opportunity that it was escaping, so the pressure was dropping. Now you've actually created leaks. What happens and how do we account for that and how do we track that? And then I've already mentioned this, but it's the leakage lagging mindset of where utilities should have been doing this and some pushback if we're generating funding from the carbon side of it. All right, let's go to the next slide, which is the opening slide to have my information on, and then I'll be dropping some links in and maybe field a few questions. Hopefully I've clarified the water balance, this kind of unaccounted for that's still pervasive out there, why we don't use a percentage basis, and then also the carbon associated with leakage. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Steve. Yes, you can take questions again in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask a question. That was a lot of really informative information. Thank you so much. Can you talk a little bit more about, thank you for putting that in the chat, about that misconceptions and the mindset you saw regarding utilities should have already been doing that? Where is that misconception coming from, and what can utilities and other local groups do to combat that?
It was actually at the Sustainable Water Conference. I think that was in Milwaukee last year, and I was in the audience, and there was a panel, and they were talking about the carbon associated with the water utility. Very high level of, hey, we reduce energy, we're reducing carbon, and so forth. And it was helpful. There was Central Arkansas was talking about the trees that they were planting and sort of trying to offset and get into carbon neutrality. And it was very much a conservation mindset. And I appreciated it. And what we're talking about when we talk about reduction of non-revenue water and reduction of leakage specifically, that's supply side conservation. So that is water that if it's not leaking out, you have it available to sell or grow or be there or mitigate the need for capacity expansion in your utilities. So it's you telling your story. So you asked what we could do as utilities out there. So you're telling your story about how you are not just circling a elusive percentage and stabbing at it or trying to get to it, but you have really followed prescriptive processes to where you're intervening at your economic levels of intervention. And that means the number of gallons per day per service connection, metrics that as your utility is growing and expanding, that you're actually able to show we have reduced that, or we've held it steady at 35 gallons per day per service connection. But in the absence of that, and this is why the percentage is so frustrating, I mean, continues to be frustrating nationally, is it means nothing. And so you see reports and then you say, well, we're about 7%. Well, that's not telling anybody anything, but also when you pull back the layers of it, it's not defensible. And so that puts more skepticism and doubt, or if you've incorrectly calculated and you're saying 30 or 40%, which can come from simple things like they've never tested the source meters. They may have done a signal calibration of it, but they've never done a hydraulic flow verification of it. And they could be grossly overstating how much water is going into the distribution system. Well, that's what builds to this. Well, you just need to go fix the leaks. And it's not as easy. So what this does is it helps to sort of push utilities to these best practices of managing non-revenue water by industry standards. And the great thing is Texas, I do encourage this group to take a look at Texas Water Development Board, the audit, the verification step, the fact that they don't use the percentage and lean into those practices. Call the team that's there. They've got an outreach team that's there to help you. And then I think that can help set targets and goals to then move forward. So yeah, that's a couple thoughts there.
Great. So I really hear you saying that those metrics and those numbers are key.
Yes, for sure.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Steve? Steve has put his email on the slides as well as in the chat, should you want to reach out to him privately. Otherwise, before we wrap up, I want to just go over a few upcoming events and resources that NCTCOG has available. The first is that our next meeting of the Regional Integration of Sustainability Efforts, or the RISE Coalition, will be meeting July 31st via Microsoft Teams. You may visit their committee page, and the link is on your screen to get more information on that meeting. We have 2 upcoming workshops and webinars. We are hosting a webinar on operational maintenance protocols and policies on July 25th at 9:30 a.m. And you may register via the link on your slides. And then in just a few days, we are hosting on Thursday, June 20th, the Energy Star Portfolio Manager webinar with the Alamo Area COG and the West Central Texas COG. That'll be a joint effort. This will be a chance to get further familiarize with the Energy Star Portfolio Manager resource and hear from communities who have used it and how it has been a support for them. And then we wanted to bring your awareness to an upcoming EPA webinar on renewable energy integration at water and wastewater utilities. Should that be something that you want to continue the conversations we've had today about the water energy nexus, that would be a great resource to you. And that will be next week on June 27th from 1 to 2. And the link to register is there on your slides. I'm going to turn it over to Savannah Nance for just a moment. She is one of our transportation planners here at NCTCOG, and she's going to talk about something that they have going on that she would like your input on.
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. And I'll be pretty quick. I just have a couple slides. So earlier, I believe one of the presenters was talking about water and wastewater and the percentage of energy that it accounts for across the entire nation, and transportation also accounts for a lot of energy as well. So actually 30% of total energy needs, the majority of all petroleum consumed, and it's about 15% of the average US household expenditures, probably especially us in Texas whenever it gets hot and our bills go up. So it's a very important part of energy efficiency, and it's something that we on the transportation department wanted to make sure that that importance was expressed to everyone. And Alyssa, if you'll go to the next slide, one of the ways that we see an opportunity to reduce energy conservation is using more fuel efficient vehicles. So that can be various ways to do that. That could be purchasing newer vehicles, not idling your vehicles, etc. But another opportunity is to use alternative fuel vehicles, which oftentimes can be more energy efficient than a conventional diesel or gasoline. And that is primarily because of the necessity to convert diesel and gasoline fuel for it to be utilized by a car, where electricity can directly just be consumed by the vehicle to propel itself, at least in battery electric versions. So if you're someone that's interested, my team, the Clean Fuels and Energy team at the North Central Texas Council of Governments in our transportation department, we are the people to talk to about all things alternative fuel vehicle related, whether light, medium, or heavy duty. And I can put a link in the chat where you can go to our website if you're interested in learning more. But one thing that we are planning to do is ask for some funding from the Environmental Protection Agency for the EPA's Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles Grant Program. There is $932 million available in this program for the replacement of Class 6 and 7 vehicles. So that could be refuse trucks, utility trucks, those heavier duty vehicles with zero emission versions. So that could be hydrogen fuel cell, if you all are familiar with that, or electric vehicles. And so we actually have a survey open right now that we are asking for people to respond if they're interested in receiving funding about that. If you have questions and you need a little more information in the program, then you can contact Clean Cities at nctcog.org. And on the left-hand side, if you're curious, that is the energy efficiency of various vocations of vehicles based off their fuel type. So I encourage you to check that out, think about it, and reach out to us if you're interested in learning more. But I will put the links in the chat where you all can respond to the survey, learn more about Clean Cities and what my team does on the Clean Fuels and Energy team. And then also, if you're curious about learning more about the program we're applying to, I'll include that link as well. Any questions?
Thank you, Savannah. We encourage you to be involved with that and check out that resource if you feel it would be helpful for you. Okay, so I want to just highlight some of the ways that you can stay connected and informed on upcoming events. We have a variety of our websites, as well as our link to get involved in and join our email list. So please feel free to visit our general website for staying in touch with NCTCOG, as well as our transportation and environment development specific websites as well. We have some resources available on our Conserve North Texas and Go Solar Texas websites. Conserve North Texas has resources related to fuel, water, and energy topics and supply conservation. Anything that you would want to know about those topics is available on the Conserve North Texas resource library. And then our Go Solar Texas page is focused solely on solar energy, questions that you may have about getting that deployed in your area, or any concerns about that will be there as a resource. And then our general NCTCOG energy management efficiency page is on there as well. You'll have access to past notices or past events, and as well as other resources available to you. We would be remiss if we didn't highlight PACE. PACE stands for the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, and it is a financing mechanism to provide water and energy efficiency upgrades to your commercial and industrial and multifamily buildings. And so NCTCOG this past year put together a resource that is the PACE Adoption in North Texas Story Map. On there, you can see where PACE has been adopted within our region, as well as PACE finance projects that have been happening. We just made an update to those maps a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. So that link is there. And then additionally, you can also see there's a frequently asked questions about how to get PACE in your community, how to get involved with that further. So please check that out if you feel that that would be good for you. And then finally, I want to highlight some resources from CECO. So CECO offers technical assistance in addition to preliminary energy assessments, PEAs, as well as some energy management policy development. The Watt Watchers program of Texas is a behavior program to elicit behavior change and conservation that is for schools and for families. And then they provide support and technical assistance for our local government energy reporting. Specifically, the PEAs is available at no cost to local governments through CECO, and this will help guide and set benchmarks for the energy use already happening, and then help local governments create better benchmarks going forward and energy efficiency guidelines. And then, as I said earlier, CECO offers no-cost technical assistance for energy or water-related technical matters. So even if you are a local government, if you are a water utility, please know that that is also available to you to provide support. And then finally, CECO offers financing support through the Texas Lone Star Revolving Program. They're having open enrollment between now and August 30th, and the link is available down at the bottom of your screen with more information. But this is a low interest rate, simple payback period, 15 years or less, that would allow you to make energy or water efficient retrofits to your properties. So closing reminders, please make sure you fill out the workshop evaluation. There's also a chance on that evaluation form to indicate an interest to be contacted by CECO regarding these resources. And then also I want to highlight our in-kind match form. If your time today was not funded through federal funds, you consider donating the value of your time to NCTCOG as an in-kind match. If you fill out this form there's more information, and that helps support the work that we do for energy efficiency through CECO. I want to highlight our CECO and SPEAR contacts. SPEAR is the South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a resource, and Sean Auckland is our good friend and program manager over there, and she has been a great resource for our region, as well as Adam Mueller, who is our program specialist for the State Energy Conservation Office. Please feel free to reach out to them with any of your energy efficiency needs, because they would be happy to help. They're wonderful. And then I want to close with just highlighting the energy management team, and those are our emails and contact information there should you have further questions. Other than that, I want to thank you all for your time and attention today. Thank you to Matt Jensen and Steve Cavanaugh for their time and their knowledge that they shared with us. Other than that, have a great day. Thank you so much.